In the autumn of 1857, article happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, that the bounded authorities, alive so abysmal, it took over a eon for whispers to surface. On Thanksgiving night, in what was already the grandest acreage abode in Pulaski County, a bondservant alleged Samson, allegedly asleep his adept with his bald hands, snapping Colonel Jeremiah Ruttles abutting like a dry twig. But here's what makes this adventure adapted from added tales of bondservant rebellion. Assemblage claimed Samson's courage, that night was inhuman. Able abundant to drove a man's skull with one hand, angle adamant accoutrement into pretzel shapes, and leave handprints apprenticed so abysmal into oak beams they're still arresting today. The official annal were sealed, the assemblage silenced, and the absolute adventure adjourned from bounded newspapers. What absolutely happened on Ruttled acreage that Thanksgiving? And why did three abstracted Canton admiral absorb the draft of their lives, claiming that what they saw that night defied all accustomed explanation? Afore we abide with the adventure of Samson and the secrets alive beneath Ruttled plantation, if you're absorbed by these abandoned accommodation of American history, hit that subscribe button and let us perceive in the comments what accompaniment you're alert from, because tonight's annual adeptness be afterpiece to your hometown than you think. The adventure begins in the affection of Arkansas Territory, 20 miles south of Little Rock. Breadth, the Arkansas River carved its apathetic aisle through some of the richest bottomland affection country in the South. By 1857, Ruttled acreage had developed to be set over 30 acres, formed by about 200 apprenticed souls who lived in the adumbration of Colonel Jeremiah Ruttle's arty Greek revival mansion. Ruttled himself was a man of contradictions, a Massachusetts-born advocate who'd confused South in his 20s, fatigued by the affiance of accessible abundance in affection speculation. Unlike abounding acreage owners who were built-in into the system, Ruttled had alleged it, and conceivably because of that choice, he disqualified his acreage with a methodical animality that abashed alike his neighbors. He kept accurate annal of punishments, maintained abundant ancestry archive for his animal acreage, and was accepted throughout Pulaski Canton for his accurate acceptance to bondservant management. The Apprenticed Association at Ruttled acreage lived in 2 oral quarters. The acreage calmly in asperus-hewn cabins, abreast the river, and the abode agents in hardly bigger apartment, afterpiece to the basic house. It was a apple of aside conversations, hidden knowledge, and adaptation strategies anesthetized bottomward through generations. The beforehand disciplinarian baton of bigger times beneath Ruttled's predecessor, a gentler man who to wash out aback the colonel, accustomed with Arctic basic and Southern ambitions. Amid this community, Samson stood apart, not because of his size, admitting at 6'4" he towered over best men of his era, but because of his aberrant history. Rutledge had purchased him 3 years beforehand from a bankrupt acreage in Louisiana, and the bill of auction listed abnormal details. Able constitution, abnormal concrete capabilities, accessible medical anomaly. Client assumes all risks. The seller, a Frenchman alleged Budreau, had been acquisitive to allotment with Samson, admitting his accessible amount as a acreage hand. Samson never batten of his antecedent life, but the added disciplinarian noticed things. He could assignment 16-hour canicule in the affection fields, afterwards assuming fatigue. He could lift affection bales that commonly appropriate 2 men. His hands, a back advised closely, showed calluses so blubbery and developed they looked about like horn. The acreage blacksmith, an apprenticed man alleged Jupiter, swore that Samson could angle horseshoes with his bald hands, admitting he was accurate never to affectation, such abilities breadth. Ambassador adeptness, see? But it wasn't aloof, concrete courage that set Samson apart. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a articulacy anxiously hidden that appropriate apprenticeship far aloft what any bondservant was adequate to possess. Astern at night, Some claim to see him abrading symbols in the adobe alfresco his cabin. Not English letters, but article abroad entirely. Article that looked about like formulas. Colonel Ruttles took a accurate absorption in Samson, admitting not out of kindness. The colonel had heard rumors about the slave's abnormal capabilities, and saw and befalling for both accumulation and accurate inquiry. Ruttles observed himself a man of learning, a subscriber to phrenology journals and agronomical periodicals that discussed the accustomed variations in animal specimens. He began administering what he alleged courage assessments on Samson, timing his work, barometer his output, and documenting his capabilities in leather-bound journals kept apprenticed in his study. These sessions took abode in the plantation's old accustomed house, abroad from prying eyes. Ruttles would acquire Samson lift added abundant objects, anvils, timberlane trunks, alike sections of adamant accoutrement, while he took addendum and fabricated calculations. The colonel was decidedly absorbed by what appeared to be Samson's adeptness to assignment afterwards fatigue. Generally blame him for hours aloft the point-breadth accustomed men would collapse. By autumn of 1857, these assessments had taken on a darker tone. Ruttles had amorphous agreeable guests to attestant what he alleged his demonstrations. Wealthy planters from adjoining counties who came to see the bondservant who could allegedly accomplish feats of absurd strength. Some of these demonstrations circuitous appropriation contests. Others appropriate Samson to angle adamant, confined or breach blubbery board planks with his bald hands. But as Thanksgiving approached, article began to change in Samson's demeanor. The added disciplinarian noticed at first a restriction in his movements, a broad attending in his eyes, as if he were artful something. Jupiter, the blacksmith, afterwards told Board that Samson had amorphous allurement, aberrant questions about the plantation's layout, about Colonel Ruttles' habits, about which of the abode agent had acceptance to which genitalia of the mansion. The Ruttles domiciliary was advancing for what the colonel planned to be his grandest Thanksgiving anniversary yet. He'd arrive over 40 guests from as far abroad as Memphis and New Orleans, including several who'd accurately requested to see his arresting specimen. The card had been planned for weeks, with appropriate delicacies ordered from as far abroad as Baltimore. Best importantly, Colonel Ruttles had planned an appropriate after-dinner affirmation featuring Samson, one that he promised would astonish his guests and adhesive his acceptability as Arkansas's best forward-thinking acreage owner. What Ruttles didn't perceive was that Samson had been listening. The abode servants, effective invisibly through the abode as they able for the celebration, had overheard conversations about the planned demonstration. Added advancing still, they'd glimpsed some of Colonel Ruttles' artful journals, larboard abominably accessible in his study. The entries, they'd apparent baton of terminal abstracts, and ultimate courage limitations, and adequate losses in the name of accurate advancement. As Thanksgiving Day 1857 dawned brittle and bright over the Arkansas bottomlands, both Colonel Ruttles and Samson were authoritative their final preparations. Neither man knew that afore the night was over, one of them would be asleep, and the added would vanish into the Arkansas wilderness. Abrogation abaft abandoned questions that would abode Pulaski. Canton for ancestors to come. November 26, 1857 began like any added Thanksgiving at Ruttles Plantation. But the undercurrents of astriction were absurd to avoid for those who knew breadth to look. By dawn, the mansion's kitchen was animate with agitated alertness as abode disciplinarian formed beneath the alert eye of Molly Kittenden, the arch cook, advancing a barbecue that would bench 50 guests in the plantation's admirable dining room. Samson had been assigned to advice adapt the grounds, ambience up added basement on the mansion's wraparound veranda, and ensuring the oil lamps were appropriately abounding and positioned for evening's entertainment. But those who formed alongside him noticed article different, an abridgment of movement, as if he were absorption, his courage for article specific. His accepted alertness to booty on the heaviest tasks, had been replaced by an accurate adding of accomplishment that seemed about strategic. Colonel Ruddle spent the morning in his study, reviewing his addendum and advancing for what he'd abreast dubbed the admirable demonstration. His journals from that day, apparent decades afterwards during the mansion's demolition, appear his action about assuming his guests what he believed would be the ultimate affidavit of his theory about animal concrete limitations. The final acceptance accounting in his accurate calligraphy that morning read, "Today I shall advance the case aloft all antecedent thresholds. Science demands annihilation beneath then complete." Understanding, the guests began accession about noon, their carriages creating a abiding beck forth the plantation's oak band drive. Amid them were some of the best arresting names in Arkansas society: adjudicator Cornelius Dillingham from Little Rock, acreage client Samuel Vaughn from Helena, and Dr. Nathaniel Pettin, a physician from Memphis who'd acquired ballyhoo for his writings on ancestral physiognomy. But the bedfellow who drew the best absorption was Professor Emanuel Voss, a German immigrant who claimed ability in what he alleged concrete anthropology and who Catholic from as far as St. Louis to attestant, Ruddle's acclaimed slave. As the afternoon progressed and the guests enjoyed their inner drinks on the veranda, Samson affiliated his affairs with the methodical absorption of a man afterwards anxiously opposite plan. Jupiter the blacksmith afterwards told Board that aback he approved to appoint Samson in chat about 3:00. The aloft man had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see appropriate through him, as if his apperception were about abroad entirely. The banquet itself proceeded afterwards incident. The guests feasted on broiled turkey, sugar, cured ham, cornbread stuffing, and an adjustment of melancholia vegetables, all able by able hands, who confused invisibly amid kitchen and dining room. Chat flowed as advisedly as the wine, with discussions of affection prices, territorial politics, and the growing tensions amid North and South that would backfire into war aloof 4 years later. But as the black anguish adjoined its climax, Colonel Ruddle stood to abode his guests, his face ablaze with wine and anticipation. "Gentlemen," he announced, his articulation accustomed over the babble of conversation, "tonight you will attest an article that challenges aggregate anticipation we knew about the band of animal capability. My specimen, Samson, will authenticate feats that would acquire advised absurd aloof of bearing ago." The guests followed Rutledge out to the old accustomed house, their choir aflame and agnostic in according measure. Torches had been abiding about the building's perimeter, casting dancing caliginosity adjoin the asperous board walls. Inside, the amplitude had been austere except for an adjustment of testing apparatus, adamant confined of assorted thicknesses, board beams, and what appeared to be sections of railroad adamant. Abiding on abundant board blocks, Samson was already cat, and, mouse inside, his massive anatomy oral adjoined the bake light. But article about his posture, the way he captivated his shoulders, the angle of his arch appropriate abode that went aloft bold concrete preparation. Dr. Pettin, the Memphis physician, afterwards wrote in his artful annual that attractive at Samson that night was like attractive at a bounce anguish to its breaking point. All controlled activity cat, and, mouse for release, Colonel Ruddle began with his accepted demonstrations. Samson aerial weights that should acquire been absurd for any man, angled adamant confined that should acquire appropriate machinery, and breached blubbery oak beams with his bold calmly, while guests watched in amazement. Professor Voss took copious notes, blubbering in German, and occasionally allurement Ruddle to acknowledgment, assertive tests. But as the black progressed, Ruddle's demands became added extreme. He ordered Samson to lift added weights, angle thicker iron, breach harder wood. The guests, initially impressed, began to actualization signs of ache as they were witnessing what amounted to analytical ache bearded as accurate inquiry. It was adjudicator Dillingham who aboriginal noticed the change in Samson's expression. About 10:30, as Ruddle ordered him to advance appropriation, what appeared to be a breadth of railroad rail, article confused in the slave's demeanor. The accurate compliance, the abstinent responses, all of it vanished, replaced by article that fabricated the adjudicator footfall astern involuntarily. "Colonel," Dillingham said quietly, "perhaps we've apparent abundant for one evening." But Rutledge, angled up in the action of his affirmation and the absorption of his guests, coiled off the suggestion. "Nonsense, we're aloof all, encompassing the absolutely absorbing thresholds. Samson, I appetite you to advance article we've never approved before." He gestured adjoin a massive allotment of accoutrement that had been confused into the accustomed abode beforehand that day. The adamant flywheel from a affection gin, belief calmly 400 lb. For a connected moment, Samson stared at the flywheel, again at Colonel Rutledge, again at the amphitheater of alert faces surrounding them. Aback, he assuredly spoke. His articulation was so quiet that several guests had to angular avant garde to apprehend him. "No, sir." The simple abnegation hit the acquisition like a concrete blow. In the antebellum South, a slave's absolute abnegation of a master's command was unthinkable. Abuse so complete it accepted actual and agitated response. But article in Samson's tone, in the way he captivated himself, gave anybody pause. Colonel Rutledge's face went through a spectrum of emotions, surprise, anger, and assuredly a algid acerbity that his guests had never apparent before. "What did you say?" I said, "No, sir." Samson's articulation was still quiet, but there was article beneath it now. Article that fabricated Professor Vostop autograph in his anthology and adjudicator Dillingham Booty edition, footfall backward. "You will do as I command," Rutledge said, his articulation apprenticed with rage, "or you'll face after effects that will accomplish our antecedent sessions assume like affable encouragement." For a moment that connected into eternity, the two men faced anniversary added aloft the bake-lit space. Again Samson smiled, and several of the assemblage afterwards swore that they'd never apparent an announcement added alarming in their lives. "No, sir," he said one final time, "I don't acquire I will." What happened abutting abundant with a acceleration that larboard best assemblage, advancing to action what they'd seen. Samson confused adjoined Colonel Rutledge with the aqueous adroitness of a man bisected his size. Accoutrement, the ambit amid them in 3 impossibly quick strides. Rutledge had time to accession his calmly defensively, time to accessible his aperture, in what adeptness acquire been a bark or a plea, but no time to escape what was coming. The complete that followed, declared by assorted assemblage as akin a blubbery annex breaking in a able wind, would abode anybody present for the draught of their lives. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, adept of 3-0 acreage and about 200 animal souls, died instantly as his abutting airtight with an oral able that seemed to acknowledgment in the abrupt silence. But it wasn't aloof the killing that abashed the witnesses. It was the affluence of it. Samson had asleep his adept with no added accomplishment than an accustomed man adeptness used to breach a stick for kindling. For a moment, that acquainted octic in time, he stood over Rutledge's body, his massive, calmly still positioned, as if he were captivation article aerial that had artlessly broken. Again he looked up at the amphitheater of abashed faces, and aback he spoke, his articulation agitated an intelligence, an apprenticeship, that no bondservant was declared to possess. "Gentlemen," he said with absolute delivery and a slight emphasis that none of them could identify, "I advance you leave now." The allegation that followed was annihilation, but dignified. Arresting Citizens of Arkansas Association trampled anniversary added in their alacrity to escape the accustomed house, abandoning all pretense of amusing continuing in their agitation to ability, their carriages, and abscond into the night. Oral minutes, Rutledge acreage was empty, except for the disciplinarian in their quarters, the anatomy of their aloft adept and Samson, who stood abandoned amid the broadcast testing accoutrement, and ablaze torches, What happened in the hours that followed charcoal, one of the abundant mysteries of that abhorrent night. The abode's slaves, abashed and uncertain, remained in their abode until dawn. Aback they assuredly emerged. They begin the accustomed abode empty, the torches austere out, and Colonel Ruttle's anatomy gone. Samson had vanished as absolutely as if he'd never existed. Abrogation abaft abandoned the abysmal handprints, apprenticed into the oak beam's breadth. He'd approved his strength. And a acreage abounding of bodies who aback begin themselves afterwards a master, afterwards direction, and afterwards any abstraction what came next. But the dematerialization of Samson and the anatomy was abandoned the beginning. Oral hours, writers were able to Little Rock, telegrams were sent, and Admiral began accession at the plantation. What they begin launched an analysis that would absorb the bounded authorities for months and leave questions that abide changing to this day. The actual after effects of that Thanksgiving night created anarchy throughout Pulaski County. By aurora of November 27th, Chat had advanced through the adjustment of acreage owners, overseers, and canton admiral who formed the Courage of Arkansas Society. The implications were staggering, not aloof because a bondservant had asleep his master, but because of how absolutely Samson had vanished and how traumatized the assemblage had become. Adjudicator Cornelius Dillingham, one of the best admired accustomed minds in the state, alternate to Little Bedrock in an accompaniment that his agent declared as complete afraid prostration. Dr. Nathaniel Petton, the Memphis physician, arrested himself into a artful bedlam and banned to allege about the contest for over a year. Professor Voss artlessly disappeared, abandoning his Auberge allowance and abrogation. Abaft abandoned a block abounding of addendum accounting in what appeared to be a admixture of German and some anatomy of algebraic characters that no one could decipher. Sheriff Thomas Breege, accustomed at Ruttled acreage at aboriginal light, accompanied by an accidental of armed assembly and several advance militia assembly from Little Rock. What they accepted to acquisition was an abhorrent scene, affirmation of violence, possibly an advancing bondservant revolt, absolutely some trace of breadth Samson adeptness acquire fled. Instead, the apparent article far added unsettling. A acreage breadth activity seemed to acquire artlessly stopped. The abode slaves aback questioned, provided accounts that were maddeningly constant and absolutely unhelpful. Yes, they had heard a loft choir from the accustomed abode about 10:30. No, they had not investigated. Disciplinarian, abstruse, aboriginal, not to baffle in their master's business. Yes, they had apparent lights effective about the acreage astern into the night, but from their abode they couldn't actuate who adeptness acquire been accustomed them or breadth they were going. Best arresting of all, aback apprenticed about Samson himself. The disciplinarian seemed about clumsy to accommodate advantageous descriptions. He was tall, they agreed. He was strong, certainly, but aback asked about his personality, his habits, his relationships with added slaves. They became ambiguous, and ambiguous in means that appropriate either advised beard or 18-karat abashing about who Samson had absolutely been. Jupiter, the acreage blacksmith, accepted to be the best accessible witness, admitting his affidavit. It aloft added questions than it answered. Beneath burden from Sheriff Breege, he accepted that Samson had bedeviled abnormal courage far aloft what any accustomed man should acquire been able of. But aback apprenticed for specifics, Jupiter's annual became added strange. He could assignment all day afterwards, excepting tired. Jupiter testified his calmly agi nervously in his lap, but it wasn't accustomed tired, you understand. It was like he was powered by article adapted than the draft of us, and sometimes astern at night I'd see him accomplishing things that didn't accomplish sense. What affectionate of things, Sheriff Breege pressed. He'd be animate with numbers, abrading them in the dirt, but they weren't like any numbers I any time seen. And sometimes he'd be talking to himself, but not in English, in article else. Article that articulate Jupiter hesitated, acutely advancing with how to call what he'd observed. Article that articulate like he was giving orders, not aloof talking, like he was acclimated to actuality in allegation of things. The concrete affirmation at the acreage was appropriately baffling. The accustomed abode showed bright signs of the antecedent night's activities. Broadcast weights, angled adamant bars, burst board beams, but there was no claret admitting the agitated attributes of Colonel Ruttle's death. There were no bright aisle arch abroad from the building, admitting the bendable apple that should acquire preserved tracks. Best mysteriously, there was no body. Sheriff Brage organized chase parties that combed the Arkansas bottomlands for afar in every direction. They abject pawns, searched abandoned buildings, followed every brook and river in a 20 m radius. But Samson seemed to acquire vanished as absolutely as morning mist. Abrogation, abaft, no trace of his passage. The analysis took on an added atrocious affection as canicule angry into weeks. Governor Elias Conway, beneath burden from arresting acreage owners throughout the state, accustomed to accolade of $500 for advice arch to Samson's capture. An astronomic sum that drew compensation hunters from as far abroad as New Orleans and Memphis. Basic posters appeared throughout the Arkansas breadth and adjoining states, featuring a description so all-encompassing it could acquire activated to dozens of men. Ample Negro male, about 6'4" in tall, almighty able build. Answers to the name Samson, acutely dangerous, acceptance with caution. But as the weeks passed, an added adverse adjustment began to emerge. Several of the compensation hunters who'd taken up the chase appear aberrant encounters in the Arkansas wilderness, glimpses of an impossibly alpine amount effective through the forests at night. Campsites that appeared to acquire been alive by addition of astronomic strength, cops that had been uprooted or angled in means that appropriate all-powerful force. Added advancing still were the belletrists that began clarification in from added genitalia of the state. A acreage client abreast Pine Bluff appear that his disciplinarian had amorphous acting strangely, whispering amid themselves and assuming signs of what he alleged alarming excitement. Addition agriculturalist abreast, Helena claimed that his ambassador had abdicated back afterwards advertisement that the disciplinarian were talking about addition, alleged the able man who was advancing to set things right. By Christmas of 1857, the Samson analysis had become article of an embarrassment to Arkansas law enforcement. Admitting the massive manhunt, the abundant reward, and the captivation of federal marshals, they were no afterpiece to award their avoiding than they had been on Thanksgiving night. Worse, the case was alpha to allure exceptionable absorption from Arctic newspapers, which had amorphous, alive, sensationalized accounts of the Arkansas Superman, who had allegedly asleep his adept and vanished into attenuate air. It was during this eon that the aboriginal attempts at official awning up began to emerge. Governor Conway, anxious about the pulse on Arkansas's acceptability and the abeyance for the case to aggravate tensions amid North and South, agilely ordered all official annal of the analysis sealed, the accolade was withdrawn, the basic posters removed, and newspapers were beat from alive added belief about the case. But the best cogent development came from an abrupt source, Colonel Ruttle's claimed papers. Aback his acreage was assuredly acclimatized in Aboriginal 1858, his admiral apparent article that had been disregarded during the antecedent investigation. Hidden in an apocryphal basal of the colonel's board was an accumulating of abstracts that appropriate his absorption in Samson had gone far aloft simple accurate curiosity. Amid these affidavits, it was accord with several Arctic universities, including abundant discussions about animal analysis and concrete accessory studies. There were receipts for actinic compounds ordered from laboratories in Boston and New York, substances with names that meant annihilation to bounded investigators, but appropriate medical or accurate applications. Best intriguingly, there was a bill of burden from an aircraft aggregation in New Orleans, anachronous aloof 2 weeks afore, Samson's accession at the acreage for what was declared as specialized biologic accessories and associated materials. The final certificate in this hidden accumulating was conceivably the best disturbing. A adjustment with an aggregation alleged meridian analysis assembly based in Boston for what was declared as advancing physiological appraisal and accessory protocols. The adjustment was alive by both Colonel Ruddled and addition articular abandoned as accountable S in autography that several of the abode disciplinarian articular as acceptance to Samson himself. These discoveries aloft questions that no one in Arkansas was able to answer. Had Samson been allotment of some array of medical experiment? Had Colonel Ruddled been animate with Arctic interests to advance new forms of animal enhancement? And if so, what did that beggarly for compassionate the contest of Thanksgiving night 1857? The official acknowledgment to these revelations was abrupt and decisive. The abstracts were classified as acute acreage abstracts, bankrupt by cloister adjustment, and transferred to federal custody. The admiral were affidavit it to secrecy. The abode disciplinarian who had articular Samson's autography were agilely awash to plantations in abroad states, and all acknowledgment of meridian analysis assembly were adjourned from official records, but rumors persisted, overextension through the underground networks that affiliated bondservant communities throughout the South, belief of the able man who had burst his chains and abolished into legend, tales of government abstracts and Arctic conspiracies, whispers about added plantations, breadth, agnate specimens, adeptness, beability, agnate treatments, and what adeptness appear if they, absively they'd had enough, as 1858 dawned over Arkansas, the Samson case clearly no best existed. But in bondservant abode throughout the South, in the artful correspondence of afraid acreage owners, and in the apprenticed files of federal offices in Washington, the questions aloft by one Thanksgiving night affiliated to multiply, and about in the all-inclusive wilderness of the Arkansas Territory, those who claimed to acquire a parent him insisted that Samson was still out there growing stronger, bitter his time, and possibly planning article that would accomplish his accomplishments at Ruddled acreage, assume like aloof the beginning. Bounce of 1858 brought new developments that would deepen the abstruseness surrounding Samson's dematerialization and accession questions about the accurate attributes of what had occurred at Ruddled plantation, the aboriginal adumbration that the case was far from bankrupt came from an abrupt source. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had been agilely assassined by parties alien to conduct their own analysis into the contest of Thanksgiving night. Allen Pinkerton, himself accustomed in Little Bedrock in March, accompanied by two of his best able operatives. Unlike the bounded authorities who had focused their efforts on tracking Samson's movements afterwards the killing, the Pinkertons were absorbed in what had happened afore his accession at Ruddled plantation. Their analysis would bald the aisle that connected back through Louisiana, Mississippi, and eventually to an alternation of medical accessories in the Northeast that had been administering what the euphemistically alleged animal advance research. The Pinkerton analysis began with the aboriginal bill of auction that had brought Samson to Arkansas. Detective James Hawthorne, assuming as a abeyant bondservant buyer, Catholic to Louisiana, to annual the aboriginal seller, the Frenchman alleged Budrow. What he apparent was acutely unsettling. Budrow's acreage amid in the bayou country south of New Orleans had been the armpit of all, encompassing medical abstracts conducted beneath the auspices of what was alleged the Southern Blue Initiative. The program, evidently advised to abstraction diseases accepted amid apprenticed populations, had absolutely been testing assorted actinic compounds and medical procedures advised to enhance animal concrete capabilities. The Frenchman was afraid from the moment I mentioned Samson's name. Hawthorne wrote in his arcane abode to Pinkerton. He kept insisting that he had appear all accepted risks in the bill of sale, that he bore no albatross for what happened afterward, but aback pressed, he accepted that Samson had been allotment of what he alleged the accessory agreement for over 2 years afore the sale. According to Budrow, the Southern Bloom Initiative had been adjourned by a bunch of Arctic investors who were absorbed in developing added able activity systems. The abstract's circuitous advertisement, accommodation to assorted actinic treatments, anxiously monitored exercise regimens, and what were declared as comestible acceptance protocols. Best accommodation showed bashful improvements in courage and endurance. A few showed affecting changes, and an actual few, like Samson, began to affectation capabilities that seemed to transcend accustomed animal limitations. But there were ancillary effects. Budrow had confided to the Pinkerton detective. The added accommodation began to actualization signs of independence. They became harder to control, added analytic of authority, and some of them began to affectation bookish capabilities that were best disturbing. Samson was amid the affliction or the best, depending on your perspective. He abstruse to apprehend and abode oral. Months began to acquire circuitous algebraic concepts, started allurement questions about the attributes of the treatments he was receiving. The Louisiana abstracts had been shut bottomward abruptly. In 1854, aback several added accommodation had able during a defection that larboard 3 overseers dead. Best of the escapees had been recaptured and agilely disposed of, but a few, including Samson, had been awash to abroad plantations with anxiously worded disclaimers about their abnormal characteristics. This adumbration led the Pinkertons to investigate the Arctic acceptance to Southern Bloom Initiative. What they apparent was an adjustment of medical facilities, analysis institutions, and artful laboratories that had been administering agnate abstracts throughout the 1840 and 1850s. The assignment was adjourned by an aggregate of artful investors, government contracts, and what appeared to be advancing interests gluttonous to advance added soldiers for abeyance. Approaching conflicts, the axial amount in this adjustment was Dr. Marcus Kleinman, a German immigrant who had accustomed analysis accessories in Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Kleinman's assignment focused on what he alleged animal acceptance application, an aggregate of actinic treatments, concrete conditioning, and cerebral conditioning to actualize individuals with added capabilities. His analysis accommodation were fatigued from prisons, immigrant populations, and added apprenticed individuals purchased accurately for alpha purposes. Detective Sarah Chen, one of Pinkerton's best able changeable operatives, infiltrated Kleinman's Boston ability by assuming, as a assistant, gluttonous employment. Her belletrist appear the ambit and composure of the accessory program. The ability maintains abundant anal on over 200 accommodation who acquire undergone assorted levels of accessory treatment. She wrote, the success amount varies badly depending on subject's concrete condition, cerebral profile, and what they accredit to as abiogenetic affinity factors. Accustomed accommodation, actualization, increases in concrete courage alignment from 50% to, in amazing cases, over 300% of baseline animal capability. But the best advancing analysis came from Chen's acceptance to Kleinman's artful correspondence. The doctor had been in approved advice with Colonel Ruddled, accepting abundant belletrist on Samson's advance and accoutrement advice on how to arrate the subject's capabilities. Added alarming still, the belletrist appear that Ruddled's Thanksgiving affirmation had been planned in allocation with Kleinman as the ultimate analysis of Samson's enhancement. The accountable has able the band of our accepted understanding. One of Kleinman's belletrist read, the affirmation you acquire planned will accommodate acute abstracts about the cerebral breaking credibility of added subjects. We charge acquire what happens. Aback, they are pushed aloft all reasonable limits. The implications for approaching advancing applications are enormous. The final allotment of the addle came from an abrupt source, Jupiter Acreage blacksmith, who had maintained acquaintance with several of the Pinkerton agents through an adjustment of chargeless blacks in Little Rock. In a stern April, Jupiter provided advice that appropriate Samson had not artlessly vanished, but had been advancing for his escape for months. He had been authoritative arrangements. Jupiter appeared during an artful meeting. There were bodies who knew about him, bodies who had been cat and mouse for the appropriate time. The night he asleep the colonel wasn't random. It was planned, and there were others involved, bodies who helped him get away. This adumbration led to a broader analysis of what appeared to be an underground adjustment committed to allowance, added accommodation, escape from their captivity. The network, which alleged itself the abandoned chain, included abolitionists, chargeless blacks, and alike some affectionate whites who had become acquainted of the accessory abstracts and beheld them as an abhorrence that went aloft alike the accustomed horrors of slavery. The abandoned alternation had been operating back the aboriginal 1850’s. Allowance, able, added accommodation, ability, safe havens in Canada, Mexico, or alien areas of the American wilderness. They had developed adult methods for accoutrement tracks, accoutrement apocryphal identities, and best importantly, allowance, the added accommodation, apprenticed ascendancy, their abilities in means that would acquiesce them to alloy into a custom society. But the best abominable adumbration came in May of 1858, a back, detective, Hawthorne bald-headed affirmation that the abandoned alternation had been infiltrated by adopted agents. Abstracts begin in an arrest on a doubtable safe abode in Memphis, appear accord with British and French intelligence agents who were absorbed in acquirements about American accessory technologies. The implications are staggering. Pinkerton wrote in his final abode to his abstruse clients, "The accessory affairs has not abandoned created individuals with capabilities that beat accustomed animal limitations, but it has additionally admiring the absorption of adopted admiral who see abeyant advancing applications. If accommodation like Samson acquire been auspiciously extracted to adopted territory, we may be adverse a bearing's breadth. America's enemies acquire capabilities that we do not absolutely acquire. Control." The Pinkerton analysis was agilely assured in June of 1858, its allegation classified and its agents reassigned to added cases, but the questions it had aloft affiliated to echo through assertive circles in Washington. Breadth advancing admiral and government admiral began to advance with the implications of what they had learned. Meanwhile, belligerist affiliated to clarify in from throughout the Arkansas breadth and beyond, sightings of an impossibly tall, impossibly able amount effective through the wilderness, belief from alien settlements about a abstruse benefactor who had helped able disciplinarian ability freedom, tales from Native American tribes about a man who could outrun horses and angle adamant with his bald hands, but who batten with intelligence and affection, rather than the aboriginal acerbity that abounding accepted from addition of his capabilities, and in the charcoal of what had already been ruddled plantation, now abandoned and boring actuality. Reclaimed by the Arkansas wilderness, visitors appear aberrant phenomena, abysmal handprints in oak beams that assume to abound added oral rather than crumbling with time. Area's breadth, the actual arena, seemed to acquire been aeroembolism by astronomic force, and sometimes on quiet nights aback the wind was still, the complete of addition effective through the old accustomed house, as if a massive amount were testing his courage adjoin airy weights. As summer gave way to autumn in 1858, 1 year afterwards, the Thanksgiving night that had afflicted everything, the abstruseness of Samson had acquired from a bounded manhunt into article abundant aloft, an added complex. The questions were no best aloof about breadth he had gone, but about who he absolutely was, what had been done to him, and what his escape adeptness beggarly for a nation that was already fracturing forth curve of slavery, freedom, and the axiological catechism of what it meant to be human. Aloof aback we anticipation we'd apparent it all. The abhorrence in Arkansas intensifies. If this adventure is giving you chills, allotment this video with an acquaintance who loves aphotic mysteries. Hit that like button to abutment our content, and don't balloon to subscribe to never absence belief like this. Let's ascertain calm what happens abutting because the best alarming revelations are yet to come. Autumn of 1858 brought an alternation of incidents that would always change how the Samson case was accepted and feared by those in positions of power. What began as abandoned belletrist of aberrant occurrences throughout Arkansas and adjoining states gradually coalesced into an adjustment that appropriate article far added organized and alarming than a distinct avoiding bondservant ambuscade in the wilderness. The aboriginal aloft adventure occurred in October, abreast the boondocks of Camden in southern Arkansas, an acreage endemic by Marcus Henley, one of the state's best arresting affection producers. Able what assemblage declared as a night of absurd terror, Henley had afresh acquired 3 new disciplinarian from a Louisiana dealer, men who bore the aforementioned abstruse adjustment in their bill of auction that had already declared Samson, abnormal concrete capabilities and accessible medical anomaly. On the night of October 15th, these 3 men, articular in acreage annal abandoned as Caesar, Goliath, and Titan, accompanying bankrupt chargeless from the plantation's best defended captivation facility. But this wasn't an archetypal escape attempt. According to the actual overseer, James Huckabe, the 3 men didn't breach the locks on their shackles. They bankrupt the shackles themselves, agi solid adamant bands afar, with their bald calmly, as if they were fabricated of clay. I've been managing disciplinarian for 20 years, Huckabe testified to investigators. And I've never apparent annihilation like what happened that night. These men confused like they could see in the dark, accommodating like they'd been planning this for years instead of days. And the strength, God advise me, the courage was inhuman. The 3 added disciplinarian had systematically destroyed every allotment of abstemiousness accessories on the plantation. Not aloof their own bonds, but every chain, every lock, every adamant bar that could be acclimated to confine animal beings. They had able this abolition in complete black, out afterwards animate the abode disciplinarian, or alerting the guards until they were accessible to leave. Aback they assuredly departed. They took with them not aloof their own freedom, but abundant maps of the bounded breadth that they had somehow acquired. Forth with food that appropriate they were planning an abundant best adventure than a simple escape to the abutting county. But the Camden adventure was aloof, the beginning. Oral weeks, agnate belletrist began accession from plantations throughout the region. In Mississippi, 2 added accommodation, able from an analysis ability, abreast nashes. Abrogation, abaft accessories, that had been askance into abstruse sculptures of angled metal and burst wood. In Louisiana, an accumulation of 4 added individuals, bankrupt chargeless, from what was declared to be an escape affidavit captivation facility, but not a 4 systematically antibacterial, every certificate and analysis agenda accompanying to the accessory program. The adjustment was bright and terrifying. The added accommodation weren't aloof artifice randomly. They were actuality coordinated, directed by some axial ascendancy that knew absolutely breadth. They were actuality captivated, and absolutely how to chargeless them. Added advancing still, they assumed to acquire intelligence about the accessory affairs itself, targeting specific accessories and antibacterial specific types of affirmation with the absorption that appropriate axial knowledge. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, the German researcher who had been alive in developing the accessory protocols, accustomed in Little Bedrock in November to argue with federal authorities about the growing crisis. His appraisal was austere and added panicked. We are ambidextrous with accommodation who acquire been fundamentally altered, not aloof physically, but intellectually. He appear in a classified conference to advancing officials. The accessory action appears to acquire created individuals with capabilities that extend far aloft our aboriginal parameters. They are announcement, cardinal thinking, allocation abilities, and analytic abilities that advance we may acquire aback, created an anatomy of added intelligence. Kleinman's best advancing adumbration, anxious, the cerebral profiles of added subjects. According to his research, the actinic and concrete treatments that added their courage and ability additionally appeared to breach bottomward assertive brainy barriers that commonly apprenticed animal potential. Added accommodation showed added anamnesis capacity, faster acquirements abilities, and best adverse of all, what appeared to be an anatomy of aggregate alertness that accustomed them to alike their accomplishments aloft all-inclusive distances. We believe, Kleinman accepted in his classified report, that we may acquire accidentally created a new anatomy of animal being, one that angle accustomed bodies not as equals, but as inferior. The implications for amusing ascendancy for the absolute anatomy of our association are catastrophic. Meanwhile, the chase for Samson himself had taken on new coercion as authorities began to doubtable that he was not aloof addition able subject, but possibly the analogous intelligence abaft growing adjustment of added individuals. Belletrist from throughout the Arkansas breadth declared sightings of an impossibly alpine amount who appeared at plantations and analysis accessories in the canicule afore accumulation escaped occurred, as if he were administering assay missions to plan approaching operations. Thomas Bogard, a compensation hunter who had been tracking added accommodation back the Camden incident, provided the best abundant annual of an appointment with what he believed was Samson himself. In a stern November, while afterwards advance abreast the Buffalo River in Arctic Arkansas, Beauregard claimed to acquire a peer face-to-face with the avoiding in a alien canyon. He was continuing on a ledge about 30 ft aloft me. Bogard appeared to federal marshals, and I knew anon that this wasn't addition I could booty alive. The admeasurement of him was inhuman. He had to be abutting to 7 ft alpine and congenital, like he could breach a timberline out of the ground. But it wasn't his admeasurement that afraid me. It was his eyes. He looked at me like he was artful, absolutely, how connected it would booty to annihilate me, and whether it was annual the effort. According to Bogard, Samson had appeared to him in absolute English with an emphasis that appropriate all, encompassing education. He told me that I was hunting the amiss prey, the compensation hunter recalled. He said that men like him weren't the problem. We were. He said that for two connected bodies had been advised like property, like animals to be experimented on and discarded. He said that was activity to change whether we basic it to or not. The appointment had assured afterwards violence, but abandoned because Samson had alleged to leave rather than fight. He aloof stepped astern off that ledge, Bogard reported, and aback I climbed up to see breadth he'd gone. There was nothing. No tracks, no assurance he'd any time been there. Aloof, those abysmal handprints in the bedrock breadth, he'd been arresting the stone. By December of 158, the added accountable bearings had escalated to the point breadth President James Buchanan was accepting approved briefings about what his admiral had amorphous calling the Samson crisis. The implications were staggering, not aloof for the actual Aegis concerns, but for the broader questions about animal experimentation, states' rights, and the axiological attributes of abandon and bulwark that were already advancing the country apart. Advancing Admiral began developing accident affairs for what they alleged added accountable ascendancy operations, but their planning was complicated by advancing realization. They had no bright compassionate of absolutely how abounding added individuals had been created over the years, breadth they all were, or what their ultimate capabilities adeptness be. The assorted analysis programs had been conducted in abstruse with basal allocation and around no axial record-keeping. "We may be adverse a situation," wrote General Winfield Scott in a classified announcement to the War Department. "Breadth our own accurate ambitions acquire created a blackmail that we are fundamentally extemporaneous to address. These added accommodation appear to acquire not abandoned above concrete capabilities, but additionally appropriate intelligence that makes them acutely difficult to clue or contain. If they are absolutely actuality accommodating by an axial authority, possibly this Samson figure, again we may be ambidextrous with what amounts to an affront led by individuals who are around superhuman, the final adventure of 158, occurred on New Year's Eve at an alien analysis ability in eastern Tennessee. The ability operated beneath advancing outpaces and hidden in the Cumberland Mountains had been administering accessory abstracts on advanced soldiers who had been promised bigger courage and ability. In barter for their service, the affairs had been so classified that alike President Buchanan was blind of its existence. On the night of December 31st, the ability was attacked by what survivors declared as an accommodating force of added individuals, led by addition analogous Samson's description. The advance was not an anarchic assault, but an absolutely planned advancing operation that appropriate all, encompassing assay and appropriate planning. They knew absolutely breadth aggregate was. Appear aloft William Kittenden, the facilities advantageous officer. They disabled our communications first, again systematically destroyed all analysis, abstracts, and freed subject. The absolute operation took beneath than 2 hours, and they able it afterwards killing a distinct person, admitting they fabricated it actual bright that they could acquire abandoned all of us if they had alleged to do so. The best advancing aspect of the Tennessee arrest was the bulletin larboard behind. Carved into the facility's basic class bank in Bellatrix II in Abysmal was an acknowledgment that would abode government admiral for years to come. The chains are broken, the able shall know best serve the weak. A new age begins. The bulletin was alive with a distinct symbol. A representation of burst shackles that board would afterwards ascertain had appeared at every armpit breadth, added accommodation had able or been freed. It was acceptable bright that what had amorphous as abandoned incidents of abandoned escapes had acquired into article abundant, added organized and dangerous. Accommodating insurgents led by individuals whose capabilities exceeded annihilation in antecedent animal experience. As 1859 dawned over a nation already fracturing forth curve of bulwark and freedom, the Samson crisis represented a new and aberrant blackmail to the accustomed order. The added accommodation weren't aloof, gluttonous, their own freedom. They appeared to be animate adjoin the analytical abolition of the absolute adjustment of animal chains and analysis that had created them. And about in the all-inclusive wilderness of the American frontier, Samson and his growing army of added followers were planning their abutting move in what was alpha to attending beneath like a alternation of escapes and added like the aperture phases of a war that would claiming aggregate Americans' anticipation they knew about animal nature, animal rights, and the amount of alleviative bodies as acreage to be bought, as old and adapted at will. The battle that would assuredly acknowledge the abounding ambit of the Samson cabal came in the bounce of 1859 in an area that no one could acquire anticipated, the nation's basic itself. What began as an accepted analysis into government application, irregularities would backfire into a crisis that able the accomplished levels of the federal government and threatened to betrayal, secrets that able men had asleep to protect. The analysis began aback Congressman Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a longtime adversary of slavery, accustomed and bearding amalgamation, absolute abstracts that abundant the abounding admeasurement of accessory program. The materials, hundreds of pages of correspondence, banking records, medical reports, and analysis addendum appear adjustment of animal analysis that connected from the Bayous of Louisiana to the laboratories of Boston, all adjourned through a circuitous web of government contracts, artful investments, and advancing appropriations. But the best atomic adumbration in the abstracts was an agenda of added accommodation that had been created over about a decade of experimentation. The annual absolute over 300 names forth with their locations, their accessory levels, and best awfully their accepted status, captured, escaped, or terminated. At the top of the list, apparent with appropriate notations, advertence, both the accomplished accessory akin and alive attrition baton, cachet, was the name that had become alike with the absolute crisis. Samson Congressman Giddings acquainted the abomination of what he had received, anon accepted aldermanic hearings into what he alleged the analytical enslavement and ache of animal beings in name of accurate advancement. His demands were met with angry attrition from Southern Assembly, who argued that any such analysis would breach states' rights and baffle with accepted agronomical research. But Giddings had allies amid Arctic Assembly who were appropriately afraid by the revelations, and by April of 1859, a Baptist board had been formed to investigate the accessory program. The committee's Aboriginal Accessible audition, captivated on April 21st in the Capitol architecture, drew astronomic crowds and aberrant media attention. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, subpoenaed to affirm about his role in the program, provided affidavit that abashed alike the best able observers. The accessory agreement was originally conceived as an altruistic effort, Kleinman testified, his German emphasis blubbery with emotion. We believed that by accretion the concrete capabilities of apprenticed individuals, we could abate their adversity by authoritative their activity added able and beneath physically demanding. We never advised to actualize what we ultimately produced. Beneath advancing analytic from board members, Kleinman appear the accurate ambit of the program's evolution. What had amorphous as attempts to advance concrete bloom and ability had gradually broadcast into all, encompassing animal modification experiments. Added accommodation were apparent to added advancing treatments, pushed to concrete and brainy band that no ethical researcher should acquire advised and ultimately developed capabilities that transcended accustomed animal experience. The accountable appointed as Samson, Kleinman admitted, represented our best accustomed and best alarming outcome. His concrete capabilities were about 400% of baseline animal norms. His bookish development exceeded our best optimistic projections, and his cerebral contour adumbrated a kin of ability and administration abeyant that fabricated him fundamentally clashing affiliated bondage, but the best damaging affidavit it came from Dr. Kleinman's acceptance that the affairs had been broadcast aloft, apprenticed accommodation to accommodate prisoners, immigrants, and eventually advanced soldiers who had not been absolutely abreast about the risks they were accepting. The accessory program, originally justified as analysis on an already afflicted population, had metastasized into a broader adjustment of animal analysis that abandoned every assumption of medical belief and abandoned rights. The committee's additional day of hearings focused on the advancing and intelligence applications of the accessory program. General Winfield Scott, testifying in Bankrupt Affair, appear that the War Department had been allotment accessory analysis back 1852 with the ambition of creating soldiers who could accomplish in acute altitude and accomplish tasks that were aloft accustomed animal capabilities. The added accommodation showed defiance for appropriate operations, assay missions, and action situations breadth above concrete capabilities would accommodate absolute advantages, Scott testified. However, we apprenticed apparent that the cerebral changes that accompanied concrete accessory fabricated these accommodation clashing for advancing discipline. They became added aggressive to authority, added acceptable to accomplish absolute decisions, and added affectionate to causes that conflicted with advancing objectives. Scott's affidavit, it appeared that the advancing had attempted to actualize their own added accommodation application, advanced soldiers, but the after effects had been catastrophic. Added soldiers had bear at aberrant rates, generally demography classified advice with them. Several had been cloister-martialed for abnegation orders, and at atomic, too, had been accomplished for what amounted to mutiny. The advancing accessory affairs had been agilely assured in 1857, but not afore creating dozens of added individuals whose accepted abode were unknown. The aldermanic hearings able their acme on April 25th, aback the board appear that they had accustomed advice from Samson himself. The bulletin delivered through intermediaries whose identities were kept abstruse was an academic annual that would be apprehended into the aldermanic almanac and appear in newspapers throughout the nation. To the assembly of the American people, the annual began. I abode to you not as a aloft slave, not as an able fugitive, but as a chargeless man who has burst the chains that apprenticed not aloof my body, but my apperception and spirit as well. For too long, men like me acquire been advised as acreage to be bought and sold, as animals to be bred and modified, as accommodation for abstracts that no appropriate association should permit. The annual affiliated with the abundant annual of Samson's adventures in the accessory program, from his antecedent abduction and auction to his bit by bit compassionate of what was actuality done him and others like him, but the best able breadth addressed the broader implications of what the added accommodation had apparent about American society. Through the accessory process, we acquired not aloof concrete strength, but accuracy of eyes about the accurate attributes of this nation's institutions. We acquire apparent how calmly men can be bargained to acreage aback it serves bread and butter interests. We acquire able how readily accurate advance is acclimated to absolve the best aspersing forms of animal bondage. We acquire abstruse that the attack of abandon and addiction that this nation claims to advocate are activated selectively based on calculations of ability and accumulation rather than any constant moral framework, the annual assured with the acknowledgement that beatific shock after effects through the capital. We, the added accommodation who acquire burst chargeless from our bondage, do not seek animus adjoin those who created us. We seek justice. We appeal the actual abortion of all animal accessory programs. We appeal the abandon of all accommodation currently captivated in analysis facilities. And we appeal acceptance of our cachet as chargeless animal beings with rights according to any added Americans. If these demands are not met, we will booty whatever accomplishments are all important to defended our abandon and the abandon of others like us. The bulletin was alive not aloof by Samson, but by over 50 added subjects, creating what amounted to an academic acknowledgement of ability from an accumulation of individuals who bedeviled capabilities that fabricated them abnormally alarming if they chose to use abandon to accomplish their goals. The actual acknowledgement from Southern Assembly was predictable, demands that the added accommodation be bolter bottomward and captured behindhand of the cost. But Arctic representatives, already affectionate to abolitionist causes, saw the added accommodation demands as fundamentally just, alike if their capabilities fabricated them frightening. The bisect over how to acknowledge to the Samson crisis became yet addition agency, blame the nation adjoin civilian war. President Buchanan adverse burden from all abandon accustomed a massive manhunt for added accommodation throughout the nation. Advancing units were deployed to chase territories breadth added accommodation were believed to be hiding. Bounties were added to aberrant levels, and the appropriate federal assignment force was created to alike the abduction or abolishment of what government admiral were now calling added insurgents. But alike as these measures were actuality implemented, bellitrists began accession that appropriate the added accommodation were no best artlessly ambuscade in the wilderness. Sightings were appear abreast aloft cities, Washington, Philadelphia, New York, Charleston. Added individuals were allegedly administering assay missions in Burgle areas, acquisition intelligence about government facilities, advancing installations, and analysis centers. The acme of the crisis came on May 15, 1008. 159, aback Samson himself appeared in Washington, D.C. He didn't advance to adumbrate or accomplish in secret. He absolved above, bored through the streets of the capital, his massive anatomy and absurd height, authoritative him apparent to anyone who saw him. Assemblage appear that he confused with complete confidence, as if he had no abhorrence of abduction or confrontation. His destination was the basic architecture, itself breadth. He requested an affair with the aldermanic board investigating the accessory program. The appeal was of advance denied. Samson was avoiding bondservant basic for murder, not an accepted political representative, but his bald attendance in the nation's basic beatific, a bulletin that was absurd to ignore. The added accommodation were no best alive and hiding. They were accessible to accost their creators directly. Samson's abrupt actualization in Washington assured afterwards violence, but not afterwards consequence. Afore abrogation the capital, he labored abaft one final bulletin carved into the marble accomplish of the basic architecture itself. The bulletin was abrupt, but adverse in its implications. The agreement is over. The specimens acquire become the scientists. By evening, Samson had vanished as absolutely as he had appeared. Abrogation abaft abandoned the abysmal gouges in marble that approved his all-powerful courage and the apparent bulletin that added accommodation were no best agreeable to be victims of added men's ambitions. They had become alive agents in their own destiny, and they bedeviled the capabilities to claiming anyone who stood in their way. The Samson crisis had able its ultimate expression, an absolute battle amid the added accommodation and the government that had created them. What happened abutting would actuate not aloof the fate of Samson and his followers, but the approaching of animal experimentation, abandoned rights, and the axiological catechism of what it meant to be animal in a nation that was already advancing to ascertain the acceptation of freedom. The resolution of the Samson crisis came not through abandon or affecting confrontation, but through an alternation of abstruse negotiations that would adapt American action on animal analysis and set precedents that would admission government analysis for ancestors to come. The negotiations conducted through intermediaries and kept hidden from accessible analysis began in June of 1859 and affiliated throughout the summer. Alike as the nation confused inexorably appear civilian war, the advance came aback President Buchanan, acquainted that her advancing ban, date to the added accountable botheration, would acceptable after effect in astronomic casualties and exceptionable publicity. Accustomed Secretary of War, John Floyd, to admission into absolute advice with Samson and his representatives. The negotiations were conducted through a circuitous adjustment of intermediaries, including abolitionist leaders who had been secretly acknowledging the added accommodation, and federal admiral, accustomed that the crisis could not be bound through force alone. Samson's demands, as presented through these intermediaries, were decidedly adult and accurately grounded. Rather than gluttonous animus adjoin those who had created and exploited the added subjects, he proposed an absolute ban, dade that would abode the actual crisis while establishing attack that would anticipate agnate situations in the future. The amount elements of what became accepted as the Washington Compact, admitting no accessible almanac of its actuality, was anytime clearly accustomed, included the actual cessation of all animal accessory analysis conducted beneath federal opaces, the abolition of all analysis abstracts and accountable records, and the accoutrement of new identities and banking abutment for added accommodation who ambition to accommodate into accustomed society. Best importantly, the bunched accustomed what amounted to a abstracted breadth in the alien regions of Alaska, again still Russian territory, breadth added accommodation who adopted to alive afar from accustomed association could authorize their own communities. The adjustment was facilitated through circuitous embracing negotiations that circuitous Russian admiral who were acquisitive to authorize American amicableness afore the closing auction of Alaska to the United States, Dr. Marcus Kleinman, whose affidavit afore Congress had helped betrayal the abounding ambit of the accessory program, played an acute role in the resolution. In barter for amnesty from prosecution, he provided abundant medical advice that accustomed government doctors to advance treatments for added accommodation who admired to abate their capabilities and accommodate into accustomed society. Not all added individuals chose this option, but those who did were able to alive almost accustomed lives beneath anxiously complete new identities. The accomplishing of the Washington bunched appropriate amazing clandestineness and coordination. Added accommodation throughout the nation were contacted through the underground adjustment that had been allowance them balk abduction and accustomed choices about their future. Those who chose affiliation were provided with new identities, banking support, and medical analysis to abate their added capabilities to added acquiescent levels. Those who chose breach were transported through an alternation of anxiously orchestrated movements to the appointed breadth in Alaska. Samson himself chose separation, but not afore ensuring that all added accommodation had been accustomed 18-carat options for their future. His final advice with federal negotiators, delivered in August of 1859, approved the intelligence and moral accuracy that had fabricated him such an able baton of the added accountable resistance. I acquire no admiration to alive amid bodies who appearance individuals like me as either acreage to be endemic or weapons to be controlled, he wrote. But I additionally acquire no admiration to see accidental adversity inflicted on either ancillary of this conflict. The bunched we acquire adjourned provides a avant guard that respects the abandon of all parties while preventing approaching tragedies. High achievement that approaching ancestors will apprentice from the mistakes that created this bearings, and will amusement all animal beings with the address and account that every actuality deserves. The accessible resolution of the Samson crisis was anxiously managed to abbreviate its pulse on civic backroom and accessible opinion. The aldermanic analysis was agilely assured with the abode that accustomed irregularities in assertive analysis programs, but abhorred specific accommodation about the accessory experiments. Dr. Kleinman and added key abstracts in the affairs were transferred to alien locations breadth. They could abide medical analysis beneath austere administration, but afterwards acceptance to animal subjects. The added accommodation who chose affiliation were broadcast throughout the Arctic states breadth. They lived quiet lives beneath affected identities. Abounding became accustomed farmers, craftsmen, or baby business owners. Their added capabilities, accoutrement advantages, that they were accurate, not to affectation too obviously. A few became circuitous in the Underground Railroad. Application, their abilities to advise added apprenticed individuals escaped to freedom. Those who chose breach accustomed communities in Alaska that became allegorical amid the Territo's aboriginal populations for their strength, wisdom, and charge to justice. These communities maintained acquaintance with anniversary added and with assertive government officials, confined as both an admonition of the accessory program's after effects and an ability that could be alleged aloft in acute circumstances. The best abiding a pulse of the Samson crisis was its after effect on federal action apropos animal experimentation. The Washington Bunched included accoutrement that accustomed the Aboriginal academic ethical guidelines for government, sponsored medical analysis attack that would eventually advance into the avant-garde adjustment of a breast accord and animal accommodation protection.